South Africa was a very different situation from India. In India, the struggle was against a power that occupied the country from far away. In South Africa, the independence movement was against the white South African minority. South Africa became technically an independent nation in 1910, when it became an independent country, but the government was controlled 100% by whites, and whites made up less than 20% of the population in South Africa. Black Africans had no political rights. So, like India, the British came to South Africa in the 19th century and established itself as a colonial power. The difference was that there were already white people in South Africa when the British arrived. These people are known as the Boers or Afrikaners. They're descended from Dutch settlers, and they arrived in South Africa in the 1600s and built settler colonies here. The Afrikaners didn't see themselves as Europeans. They were Africans, permanent residents, not imperialists, not colonialists. They were in South Africa to stay. So, during the British colonial period, we have a mix of British colonialists, Afrikaners, Black Africans, and mixed-race people. And there ends up being a war fought between the Afrikaners and the British colonialists between 1899 and 1902. This is known as the Boer War. But both the British and the Afrikaners felt that their way of life would be threatened by black majority rule. India didn't have a big white community, South Africa did, and because of this, South Africa wasn't able to gain real independence until 1994. But the economic situation in South Africa was different from India. By the early 20th century, South Africa was already well on its way to being an industrialized nation, and by the middle of the 20th century, South Africa produced steels, had chemical plants, made automobiles, had rubber processing plants, had diamond mines, gold mines, and all of these enterprises were owned by whites, but they depended on the labor of black Africans. And black Africans worked in the diamond and gold mines and the white-owned farms. In fact, most black Africans either worked for whites or received payments from those who did. Blacks and whites were connected economically, even if they were separated racially. And it's this racial segregation that's the third major difference between South Africa and India. Explicit policies of racial segregation. In Africa, or South Africa, the system of racial segregation is known as Apartheid, and the main goal is to keep blacks and whites separated in every aspect of social life, except for in the work environment, because the whites still needed the labor power of the blacks. In rural areas, black Africans lived in native reservations, and these native reservations were divided along tribal lines. There was certainly racism in colonial India, but there was nothing approaching the really, really radical racial segregation in South Africa. So those are some of the key differences between India and South Africa. There are also some similarities between the two. Like in India, the masses weren't happy about how they were being ruled, and there were a number of rebellions and strikes made in protest against the white-only government. And just like in India, a group of elite educated people came and represented the black African masses. In India, this was the African National Congress, or ANC, which formed in 1912. So India has the INC, South Africa has the ANC. But in 1948, an Afrikaner nationalist party came to power on the promise of bringing full racial segregation to South Africa. They had the support of the majority of whites in South Africa. The policy of racial segregation and limited rights for blacks is known as Apartheid. So the first generation of ANC leaders in the first half of the 20th century were typically polite, they were more passive. The second generation of ANC leaders were a lot more assertive and aggressive. This is a group that led the ANC during the 1950s and during the implementation of apartheid. So in this context, India had just gained independence, and the leaders were deeply inspired by Mohandas Gandhi and his philosophies of nonviolent civil disobedience, and they credited this nonviolent civil disobedience for bringing independence in India. Among the leaders of the ANC was Nelson Mandela, who will much later go on to become the first black president of South Africa. But in the 1950s, what they didn't count on was there's a big difference between the attitudes of whites in Great Britain and the attitudes of whites in South Africa. After World War II, Britain held itself up as being a model nation. It was more progressive, and initially the British violently put down Indian nonviolence, but it wasn't something they could continue to do. British citizens wouldn't be comfortable with sending the army in to crush people who were protesting peacefully. That type of behavior conflicted too much with what British people saw themselves as. This wasn't the case in South Africa. The government was extremely repressive. They shot people, they banned the ANC, they imprisoned ANC leaders. Nelson Mandela was arrested and sentenced to a long term in prison. So things ended up much differently than in India. They tried nonviolent resistance and they were massacred. So the movement became radical. The nationalist leaders went underground and turned to armed struggle and prepared for a guerrilla war between blacks and whites in South Africa. And these internal tensions all came to a head in 1976 when South Africa broke out into mass protests. The thing that sparked the mass protests was a decision made by the Afrikaner Apartheid government that all education would be in the Afrikaner language instead of English, which most blacks spoke. The rebellion broke in an impoverished reservation on the outskirts of Johannesburg called Soweto, and this happened in the 1970s. The struggle continued through much of the 1980s. By the mid-1980s, the government was forced to declare a state of emergency. So, the apartheid government was facing a lot of internal pressure from black Africans. At the same time, they were facing a lot of international pressure. This is the 1980s. You shouldn't be able to get away with this kind of stuff anymore. South Africa was banned from competing in the Olympics. Musicians wouldn't perform in South Africa. Basically, the Western world turned their back on South Africa, and this was really hard for the white population of South Africa because they viewed themselves as being part of Western civilization. And now Western civilization was turning their back on them. So it was a combination of the internal rebellions that were never going to stop under the blatantly racist political system of apartheid and international pressure that made South Africans feel more and more isolated. A revolution was coming, and nobody was going to come to help the apartheid government. So the apartheid government decided that the only way they could avoid a massive bloody revolution was reform, and these reforms would come. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released, the ANC was legalized, many of the apartheid policies were abandoned, and national elections were eventually held where black people had the right to vote. Not surprisingly, Nelson Mandela was voted president, and he became the first black president of South Africa. So the nightmare of apartheid was over much, much later than India achieved independence. There were internal divisions among South Africans, different groups of South Africans, and some violence, but nothing approaching the scale of the massive killings of Hindus and Muslims that came along with the partition of British India into India and Pakistan. And South Africa obtained political freedom as one intact and unified state. So, this is the end of episode 28, Decolonization and 20th Century Independence Movements. Thank you for listening.